Hello everybody and welcome back. My name is Winback, and on today's episode we are looking at the Trickster build, playing through the key dungeon of Bastion of Chaos. This build is going to be all melee all the time, dual wielding. This is a Nightblade and a Shaman, and this build will deal absolutely tons of damage. With that being said, remember this is a YouTube video, so feel free to like, comment, and subscribe your heart out while we whip out all of the prerequisites to play this build. I am going to put a disclaimer on it because I think it suits the video as well as the video that came before it. This build came out of our Theory Crafting 101, and this is actually a respec that I have gotten a lot more mileage out of as of, playing further into the game. I know that sounds kind of silly, but at the end of all things, I started out making this build with too many options. I had too many different things that I wanted to do, and ultimately that distracted me from what makes the build fun and what I really wanted to be the key parts of the build. So all things considered, this is one of my earlier builds, way before I really started, hunkering down and learning a thing or two about the game. And after having played it again recently, I definitely felt that it needed to respec. So we'll talk about the respec a little bit more in detail, since it is pertinent to how the build plays and the ultimate change in functionality that we've gone with. But more than that, I'll give you the skills, the devotions, and the current set of gear that we are rocking to make things a little bit easier to follow if you want to pick this build up on your own. In addition to that, we'll be running more key dungeons with these build videos because they are much better form of litmus test for the builds themselves. We're only on Elite right now since I haven't gone far enough with this build to take it into Ultimate. Usually we want to hit about 82 before we start playing in Ultimate, so we have access to Ultimate gear, or Mythical gear, and then 94 is the absolute most time I would use in any difficulty that is not Ultimate, because if you're waiting that long, then you're probably getting some pretty diminishing returns on the XP. All that being said though, let's talk about the Trickster. To kick things off, we'll talk about the most important skills or abilities in this build and what I've decided to focus things around. You may have noticed that there are a lot of buttons on that hotbar still, but only a couple of them are actually Nightblade and Shaman type abilities. Number one, we've got Ring of Steel and its modifier, Circle of Slaughter. Those are incredibly important to the type of burst damage that this build is going to do, and they have subsequently got almost completely maxed out. They're over 20 points as it stands right now. Next, we have a lot of points into a passive ability called Dual Blades. That is the Nightblade passive that lets you wield two melee weapons at any given time, gives you an absolute donkin amount of piercing damage, and it gives you physical resistance as well. Super important because we want to be slinging two swords at any given time to meet with the edgy Nightblade aesthetic on the Trickster. Now, in terms of signature skills that you can have buttons for with this build, there aren't many, because abilities that we're using when it comes to the Trickster are mainly focused on defensive and movement options, and because of that, they're not really heavy in damage outside of Ring of Steel. That being said, most of our abilities that deal damage are going to come in the form of auto attack modifiers and gear provided abilities, and the main reason that we are using those is because they do the same types of damage and they are going to proc a decent chunk of our devotion abilities, making them invaluable in their own right. Now, there are three specific abilities of the passive auto attack modifying variety that should be considered very important for your build, and that, number 1, will be Belgothian's Shears, number 2 is Amarasta's Quick Cut, and number 3 is Whirling Death. Each of these is dealing piercing damage in some form or fashion, and each of them also has their own unique property that makes them important when we just stand there face... I don't want to call it tanking, because a lot of stuff just dies when we whack it. But the other thing to consider is that each of these, with the number of points that we have in each of these modifiers, we have about a 23 to 25% chance to activate them. So that means 3 out of every 4 auto attacks should have some type of modifier on it. We don't know which one we're going to get, but at least math-wise, that's what makes sense to me. So, all that being said, Belgothian's Shears is going to stun targets while dealing damage to 3 people in an AoE at most. Amarasta's Quick Cut is going to deal piercing damage with increased crit damage, which is just fantastic for dealing damage. And then Whirling Death is going to hit in a 360-degree arc all around us, dealing piercing and bleeding damage, which is immeasurably good for thinning out the herd. All that being said, you will use all of these passives after you land your Ring of Steel, which should clear out the vast majority of the garbage while you're focusing on bigger enemies. So, that is it for signature abilities. Everything in the Shaman tree, much to my sadness, is going to be more to support the Nightblade options, but more importantly than that, there is a devotion, 2 devotions actually, built into this kit that are more important than the abilities themselves, and that is because these devotions look way cool. So number 1, the coolest looking one, is going to be the Living Shadow, and you get that from the Unknown Soldier devotion all the way at the end of, I'd call it bottom right, so it was at southeast corner. And then if you go just straight east, you get Azraka the Eternal Sands and her Shifting Sands ability. Both of these are insanely easy for our character to launch because Shifting Sands is assigned to Ring of Steel. It has a 20% chance to go off, and because we can hit anywhere from, 5 to 10 different enemies at a time with Ring of Steel, we get a very, very good chance to launch that bad boy. When this goes out, it is dealing physical piercing damage with increased crit damage. It passes through enemies, and it reduces offensive ability with a possibility of blinding targets hit as well. So all around, the sands are super good. The effect is a little bit hard to notice sometimes because it is just kind of all over the ground. It's little sprinkles of dirt. But they are golden. So, I mean, you're showering the enemies in gold. Yeah. Anyway, the Living Shadows are going to be... Well, obviously they're the mainstay of the build. I think they look very, very good, and seeing as how it's a Trickster, it's perfectly thematic to have Shadow Clone Jutsus following you around, dealing the exact same kind of damage that you do. The Living Shadows also have Shadow Strike, which means that they can poof out of nowhere and attack enemies in an instant, just like the Nightblade can. And they have another ability called Shadow Blades, which deals piercing damage, and both of those abilities are actually going to convert their damage to health. The Living Shadows do not have a health bar. The damage they are doing is being converted to you, the player. So remember, they get quite a bit going for you, and they are unkillable, but they only require that you get a 100%, they only require that you get a critical attack. You have to land a crit to summon a Living Shadow, and the best way to do that, at least in my case, is using Savagery. So we're going to bind that to Savagery from the Shaman tree, and we are just going to auto attack like it is going out of style. after we jump in, after we land our Ring of Steel, and stuff is still standing. Because sometimes we get lucky enough, but the good news is you can have up to 3 living shadows, and with the amount of attacking that you can do with Savagery, it is really easy to get those living shadows out. I can get 3 pretty consistently if I am in a pack of tanky enemies, but 2 is impossibly easy to get. So you can be basically followed around permanently by shadow soldiers, and it is fantastic. There are a couple other activatable devotions though, namely the Blades of Wrath is going to come from the Assassin devotion, and this is equipped to Belgothian's Shears. This is just going to launch knives out in a circular AoE. They all do piercing damage, and they all go through targets hit. It is very, very good for thinning the herd with just regular old auto attacks. It is also an activate on critical attack, so basically we have to get Belgothian's Shears to activate, and then it has to be a crit when it hits. But you'd be surprised how often it works. It's a lot. I'll leave you with that. The blades also deal more damage the further away that they go, but they deal the least amount of damage up close. It's 30% reduced damage the closer that they hit towards you. So it's kind of good, but it's definitely better for thinning out enemies that are farther outside the mob that you're attacking. And then lastly, we've got Assassin's Mark. Can you sense the theme? It is slapping you in the face right now, if you haven't noticed. But Assassin's Mark is another 100% chance to activate on critical attack, and it is going to reduce physical and pierce resistance for 18 seconds. It is gross. Absolutely fantastic for what we need it to do, because pierce resistance is, or sorry, pierce damage is our main form of damage in this build, and how can you ever go wrong with reducing physical resistance, right? The other devotions in the build are going to be the Harpy. We've got Blades of Nadan Crane. There is Eel and Stag, and then the there we go. It is the Empty Throne. Empty Throne is full of really juicy defensive stats and resistances that help me live longer. The last honorable mention I'm going to have is the Dryad's Blessing. So Dryad, in and of itself, I had to definitely move as many points around as possible, but Dryad's Blessing gives you health back, gives you armor, and it reduces bleeding and poison duration. So it's super, super, super useful for melee characters who do a lot of attacking, because it activates on a 30% chance, 33% chance. So every third auto attack, you should be able to proc it. If you're using it on an auto attack ability like Savagery or Cadence or what have you. I personally have it attached to Behead because we're using Behead from a component in one of our weapons, and honestly, it works just as well. It's a little bit more involved. I can be more cognizant of when I get that heal, even if it is less fast. If I don't want it right away, I don't have to waste it, because it is a 10-second duration. It is a 2.5-second skill recharge. So things are looking up for using the Dryad's Blessing when I want it to work. All that being said, there is your quick rundown of the devotions. As far as gear is concerned, there is a couple things to know. A couple things that are working incredibly well in Elite and will probably carry me up to level 94 as far as usable in Ultimate. Slaughter is our relic. This is just a Transcendent relic. I haven't actually completed the Mythical relic yet. I've still got some researching to do on that. But Bloodbath, if you didn't know, actually gives you the ability to dual wield. Sorry, Bloodbath is the ability that the Slaughter relic gives you. But Slaughter also gives you a passive to dual wield melee weapons. So if you don't have a Nightblade, but you like Slaughter and you want to use 2 weapons, you can still do that. Just equip this relic. It's fantastic. It is kind of sad that it only gives +1 to all skills in Nightblade, because I could see lots of other classes benefiting from dual wielding, but they'd probably be pretty upset about the 1 to all skills in Nightblade. Or maybe you just don't want to take dual blades. Maybe you just want to be able to dual wield without using that that thingy. So there you have it. Anyway, Bloodbath itself is going to do bleeding damage. It's going to hit in an AoE, and it's going to do 220% weapon damage. So it's only a 1.5 second skill recharge, and it does a pretty frightening amount of work up close for clumpy enemies. We're also rocking a couple set pieces. Not the whole set, but the death marked set. We're using the jacket and the shoulder guard, which is giving us points into quick cut, whirling death, dual blades, and shadow dance, while also giving us some buffs to our pierce and cold damage. This set is incredibly good. I don't know if I'm going to transition to it for ultimate is as a full set, because the other parts of the set are the hat and the 2 weapons, and I do kind of like the 2 weapons that I'm rocking right now. The other ability that we're getting right now is called Ice Chill, which is from Knight's Embrace, which is our amulet. Ice Chill is a really cool ability that you activate. It's got a 12-second duration, double that for cooldown, but it is just an AoE dealing cold and frostburn damage, and reducing the reducing enemies' freeze resistance, so they're more likely to get frozen. Unfortunately, we're not using the freezing aspect of Ring of Steel, so that is a little bit lost. The ability itself is a little bit lost, but Knight's Embrace does provide pierce damage, cold damage, and some maximum cold resistance and offensive ability. I am pretty sad I'm mentioning it this far into the video, but offensive ability is really important for this build because you need a metric donk load to get those critical hits at any consistent amount. It's going to actually be even more important in Ultimate, so hopefully we start finding gear that really works things there. Lastly, the Blade Breaker Sash is our belt. Gutworm's Mark of Fortitude is our medal. That's giving a whole bunch of extra damage to Ring of Steel. And then my weapons are the Brutalaxe and Reaver's Claw. These are providing some big point boosts into Ring of Steel. Reaver's Claw actually gives us another Ring of Steel when we get a crit. Just a 50% chance on critical attack to get another Ring of Steel, which is awesome. But that is really all that I have time to talk about. The key dungeon is done. We're selling all of our ill-gotten gains to the town lady, and there's going to be more to talk about in the next video, so stay tuned for the ultimate version of this build if you are interested in taking it that far, and I will see you guys next time.